You still have CEOs thinking they can make people decisions with their gut. You've got boards really not sure what numbers they need to have to know whether the people stuff is working. You see a lot of really poor decisions about people and work, etc., by very, very bright people in other areas.
Welcome to The Courageous Choice, the podcast where we explore bold decisions that shape leaders, organizations, and the future of work. I'm your host, Jamie Jacobs. In this special 3-part mini-series, we're diving deep into the future of HR, a world where the pace of change has never been faster. From AI innovation and the rise of the gig economy to shifting workforce expectations and bold new leadership models, the HR landscape is being redefined in real time. Across these episodes, I'll be joined by 3 remarkable guests, thought leaders and trailblazers in the HR space, to explore the big questions every organization needs to be asking right now. Together, we'll uncover how courageous HR leaders can navigate uncertainty, embrace transformation, and design workplaces that don't just keep up with the future, but shape it. Whether you're an HR leader, an executive, or are simply passionate about building better workplaces, these conversations will challenge you to think differently and lead boldly. Let's dive in. Hi, and welcome to this episode of The Courageous Choice. Really excited to be kicking off a series of the future of HR. So we have a lot of conversations about courage. We have a lot of conversations about leadership. And this is really looking at it through the lens of the human resources function. You can call it human capital. You can call it talent. You can call it lots of things. And that's what John Boudreau, my guest today, and I are going to be talking a lot about. John is an expert in this and is actually writing a book. So I can't wait to dive in and learn a little bit about his research, his studies, and really his outlook on this, because we talk a lot about how this profession evolves, the evolution of really other functions, and how the HR functions can be ambiguous as far as the role at the executive table with the board of directors, and really what is encompassed in that. And even in the fact that I wanted to use a bunch of different words to define it, tells us a little bit that it's not always so clear. So welcome, John. Can you just share a little bit about your background? Because I wanted to tout your bio, but I think it'd be better coming from you.
Well, it's over 40 years. So I started at Cornell University in 1981. That was my first job after my PhD. So there's a lot of ground to cover. These days, I get more people coming up saying, you don't know me, but I was in the audience of a workshop that my boss put together. And so I know their boss. And now this person who was in the audience is now the head of HR somewhere. So yeah, the background is all pretty much involved in work and the future of work and HR and that kind of thing. I got fascinated with it even as an undergrad, hearing about at that time the Japanese management system and lean and giving frontline workers the power to stop the line, all that kind of thing. And my professor said, yeah, this stuff's called human resources and organizational behavior. And so off to Purdue to get an MBA and then a PhD, and then off to Cornell. And I was there for 22 years, from starting assistant professor to tenured full professor, with helped found the Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies, which continues today. And then after 22 years in the early 2000s, Ed Lawler at the University of Southern California, whom I'd known for decades, said, are your daughters out of the house, and graduated Cornell and understood it was probably time to make a change. So off we went to Los Angeles, and then 15 years there, and got to work even more deeply with someone you and I both know very well, Ian Ziskin. He was the head of HR at Northrop Grumman. And of course, I'd known Ian. He's a graduate of the Cornell ILR school, but we really got to work together quite a bit when I was there in Los Angeles. And then about 2016, started the process of semi-retiring, and retired the professorship in 2019, right before COVID, in part because understandably, my dean said, I know you live in Santa Fe and you'd like to do 2 remote classes and 1 in person over a 15-week session. And I can't imagine ever proposing that to the provost for at least a decade. So had I said, I'll try it one more time, I would have been remote anyway. And then since then, here in my office in Santa Fe, working with, I'll give credit to my colleague Pete Ramstead on the stuff we'll talk about today. And then also just wonderful conversations with folks like you, Jamie, and a number of other retired or starting to retire heads of HR like Ian and folks. So I've got this wonderful network now of monthly calls with folks that are really fun to talk about this stuff with. Yeah, so that's kind of, I travel once in a while, but a lot of my work these days is remote from here in beautiful Santa Fe.
I fall into that category of I knew you before you knew me, I think, and had been in the audience multiple times. And one of the things I'm so grateful for with this podcast is it's giving me this opportunity to connect with people like you and Ian and people that I've looked up to and admired in my career and really engage in conversations that, quite frankly, I would do in private on a Friday night because they're just that interesting to me. I geek out on this stuff, but now we get to share it with others and hopefully spark some other great conversations from it. So thank you for being with us
My
today.
pleasure. Thank you.
The most recent time we were together, it was in May, and we were at a conference and we were talking about the role of HR and the role of HR leaders. And there was a lot of conversation around why is it so undefined? And I'd love for you to maybe share some of what you've been looking at and what you've learned.
As I said, I've been at this for 40 years, and the trajectory was like this. I did my dissertation on formulas to predict the money value of investments in people. I was kind of early on in it, but a number of people were working on it, Wayne Cassio and others whom I've had the pleasure to work with. And we were calculating formulas to say, look, if you select people better, here's the logic about why that's going to pay off. And one of the tricky things was we had all the correlations from psychology. We could correlate selection tests with performance ratings, for example, but that's not dollar values. So the trick was to turn something like a distribution of performance into a dollar value. And I won't go into the details on that, but I thought now that we've got this figured out, C suites and boards and investors are going to now be able to know the millions and millions of dollars that are often untapped because organizations are not investing in evidence-based things like pay for performance and selecting based on things that are really valid and developing learning that's really job related. All that stuff was calculable and plenty of formulas running around. And I realized for a lot of different reasons, it fell on deaf ears and spent a lot of time trying to figure out how is it that this very logical, very evidence-based approach to monetizing investments in people doesn't seem to land with people in other disciplines. And that began a whole career of trying different things. And we can talk about some of that. And I think upon retirement now, and really talking with other retired CHROs and Pete Ramstead, my writing colleague being among them, former CHRO, kind of realized lots of people have that frustration. It's not that the profession hasn't advanced dramatically, but it's advanced less far than a lot of people thought. If you look at people with 30-year careers and you say, what did you think the HR profession would be like by now? It's usually not quite as advanced as we might have thought. And so Pete and I began to think about that, and we realized that we have, and lots of other people have, provided excellent frameworks for the logical link between better talent investments and organization performance. There's plenty of data. There's plenty of analytics. Not that we can't improve all that stuff, but we kind of said it doesn't look like better analytics, better frameworks, et cetera, really are the thing because we've had that for decades. And just the needle doesn't seem to have moved. You still have CEOs thinking they can make people decisions with their gut. You've got boards really not sure what numbers they need to have to know whether the people stuff is working. You see a lot of really poor decisions about people and work, et cetera, by very, very bright people in other areas. And so Pete and I began to toy with the hypothesis that perhaps it was that it's not that we don't have great data, great frameworks, et cetera, but it's not being heard by the decision makers we all hoped would be listening to it. The CEOs, the boards, the investors, et cetera, just are not routinely incorporating all this evidence and analytics we have into the way they think, into their mental models. And so instead, they tend to still believe you can do it by your gut, et cetera. And we began to then develop some framework of platforms, and I'll just list them for you. So we began to think about what are the leadership platforms that the CHRO and the function has available. One is running the function very well. That's pretty well established. Another one is organizational talent strategy, which would be things like your approach to AI and its combination with people, your approach to deconstructing work and reconstructing it, organization design, et cetera. Those two are places where HR plays pretty regularly. But then there's others, like the relationship with the senior team, the relationship with the board of directors, or whatever your governance structure is. If you're not publicly traded, it might be a founder or it might be a set of investors. And then finally, the engagement with the strategy process. And as Pete then pointed out, he's held two CHRO jobs. He said, John, what I noticed was my two jobs were diametrically different. on the way that I was included with the board, with the C-suite team, with the strategy process. One organization, a consultant would run the comp committee, and I was really not invited. That thank you very much, but you're in HR and that's not who is on this committee. At the other organization, they said, welcome to our company. You're running the comp committee meeting. And so, as we've talked to other CHROs about this using this 5 pillar framework, they've resonated a lot to the idea that, yeah, this role, the CHRO role, is far more malleable, far more diverse than, say, the CFO role. And in fact, a lot of them are saying really than any other C suite role. But if you think about the CFO role, the relationship with the board is very standard. You do not say, thank you very much, but we'll call you when we need you to the CFO. But you can to the CHRO. The board doesn't say, well, we don't have a relationship. We don't really know our CFO. No, the board has a deep, intimate relationship with the CFO through the standardized kinds of engagements that the SEC and GAAP or whatever European laws are. Same thing with the strategy process. It's very unheard of, really, that the CFO isn't deeply involved from front to back. In fact, they often run the strategy process. Whereas with the CHRO, it can range anywhere from after we finish our strategy, we'll hand it to you and you go align the workforce, all the way to some of the more impactful CHROs saying, I actually run the process and I evaluate the top team on how good they are at this capability of strategizing. So that variability at first, Pete and I thought was a bug in the CHRO role. Like, why can't we have a more defined role like the CFO? Why isn't it more externally defined? As we talk to CHROs who are often, certainly in my case, more experienced and smarter than me, a lot of them said, well, that's why I got into the head of HR role, because it is shapeable, because it does have all that variability. And as you and I talked about, Jamie, it takes what we might call courage to step up and exploit or harness that variability and shape the role in a way that makes it more impactful because it isn't defined externally that way. And I was just pleased to see that so many of these CHROs had stories about courageously. One of the themes, for example, is show up at meetings where you weren't invited. Put them on your calendar and show up at strategy meetings, show up at meetings of the board. I believe Ian's told this story, but Ian Ziskin, for example, said, no one asked me to go visit every single one of our 100 unit leaders at Northrop Grumman. But that's what I did in my first, 200 days. And a lot of them said, what are you doing here? You're the HR person. I don't see what you're doing in my office. But he said, by the time I finished those visits, I had a sense of the leadership of that organization that you couldn't get any other way. And I could bring insights into the board and others about our leadership and begin to establish the credibility that this HR function can bring something very unique and very important to discussions about things like the capabilities and the performance of our leadership team.
I love that. And yeah, he definitely wasn't waiting for permission or waiting for someone else to define it. And I think that does take courage. Over the past, I don't know, decade, 15 years, as this profession has evolved, a lot of times we were talking about building the skills, right? We were like, oh, a lot of maybe the HR professionals are lacking in some way and they just didn't have the business acumen. They didn't have the savvy or the financial awareness to be able to navigate some of these strategic business conversations. And I think that still varies, but that varies in any function, right? If you're talking to an AP clerk, they don't have capital markets or FP&A, right? So you can have functional expertise. But I would say on a whole, at the senior level, hopefully they have that experience. The question that you are starting to dive into is how do they apply it, right? And how are they being intentional around what is the role and how do they show up? And so I love that you're working to define this framework that I think will be helpful for people in role or new in role, and even a little bit for CEOs who I think there's different expectations. And part of it is we're not going to necessarily have to wait for permission, but it's like even a good EA, right? Like a good EA for me is going to teach me how to use them. And you and I talked about that there's this opportunity, we called it exploiting that ambiguity, but it's really around how do you make that work for you? So maybe you can share. I love the stories and the examples because it might create an aha moment for a listener that, might spark some courage into action. It's not courage by itself, it's the action that drives those results. So you talked about with the board of directors, the strategy process, the senior team. I think you told a story about the senior team and kind of asserting yourself that was particularly interesting when we were talking before.
Yep, I'm happy to do it. You may need to remind me a little bit of the details here. I think in general, one of the things that Pete and I are hearing and have developed is with the senior team is this idea of functional boundaries, for example. So obviously there are tactics that one can use to be more visible, just logistically with the senior team. I think in general, one of the ways that HR can begin the process is to start where I think everybody would recognize HR's expertise, something like onboarding or evaluation or something like that. So when you have a senior team vacancy, is HR involved in defining the criteria, in the process of bringing people in, and maybe almost most importantly, in some cases, the process of onboarding? New senior team people come in, they've got all kinds of things they need to learn, all kinds of whatever, I won't say doubts, but things they're not sure of, things they want to improve on. And if the HR leader is seen to be the person that is helping them through that onboarding process, helping them understand the organization, helping them get a handle on their own role, maybe even running a process of evaluation and feedback, that's going to create a very strong relationship with the C-suite team because you'll know them and they know you and they know you in a personal, trusted way. And it really stems from a proposal that's something like, look, we in the HR function are doing onboarding, selection, and counseling to new members all the time. And we know something about that. And might it be helpful to bring some of that expertise to what we do with the C-suite team? What that does then is when you hit something, let's just take today's, I won't call it a bright, shiny object, but it certainly is a fixation of AI and AI and work in the organization. Lots of proposals about maybe we combine the HR function with the IT function or the CHRO with the head of IT. Lots of admonitions that this is really a work issue, not a technology issue, or at least it's both. And therefore, you'd want someone with expertise on work and work design involved in these conversations. It isn't just a slap on the tech and hand back the FTEs kind of a formula, if it ever was. And what I think you don't want is that nobody knows the HR leader until somebody says, we ought to get somebody in here to talk about AI and work. And then they invite this person that nobody really knows and nobody has a relationship with. And they come in with wonderful frameworks and concepts and evidence based ideas, but it's this new person that nobody has a relationship with. So part of what Pete and I would like to see across all of these platforms is that the CHRO and then by extension the function are building the position of influence, the position of trust by exploiting in a way their existing platforms, the platform of knowledge about onboarding, knowledge about counseling, knowledge about performance and feedback, so that when the day comes, there needs to be an AI and work discussion, everybody turns quite naturally to the CHRO because we've already been having these kinds of discussions. You're already involved in the strategy process. So it's almost, I won't say quite a Trojan horse, but the idea is to build from where people would recognize your expertise. And a lot of the theme is things like onboarding and selection, CEO succession, board succession. You've got a lot of these things that are going to happen. And a starting point might be for HR to, what shall I say, use their existing functional platforms to extend their influence.
I love that. First of all, it's like non-threatening, right? Nobody's going to argue that HR should own onboarding. And the idea of owning it all the way up the chain at the executive level and even at the board of directors level, which you talked about with me. I mean, people don't always assume that as a CHRO. You don't always assume that you can get involved in that, but it would seem very natural. And quite frankly, like you're even proactively working to solve an organizational opportunity in your area of expertise. I mean, it kind of just makes sense and yet may have been something that either was overlooked or maybe outsourced if you don't step into that.
Yeah, just out of habit. And because the role is so malleable, what you often get is a pattern where a new CHRO pretty much inherited the role that the past CHRO put together. And what we hear over and over from the people we're talking with, a little bit of self-aggrandizing, but saying, I wish this framework had existed. I wish I had this when I was starting. because then I could have held up a framework like this, looked across the 5 platforms, and asked myself, where am I really here? And am I accepting something that, while it may have been satisfactory before, really isn't as conducive to my leadership impact as I'd like it to be? And could I start a conversation about how to move on one or more of these that would be pivotal for that particular person?
It's so striking. We were calling it like an active practice, right? Establishing that active practice of using this framework. And I think of it almost as like a self kind of SWOT analysis, like looking around, okay, where do I have the relationships where they need to be? Is there a gap where they wouldn't automatically think of me if they were thinking about organizational capabilities or people capabilities or how work gets done or strategy, and how do I lean into that? Sometimes I know our nature can be to maybe avoid it if it's uncomfortable or we don't know how to start. And that doesn't serve typically the results that we'd like. So I'm really excited for the book and the 5 pillars so that, like you said, it's an ongoing process because it might be fine now. And then some work gets done, and the world, we know the pace of change is so fast right now. We need to be looking at this pretty regularly.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Jamie, there are some, I think, some real implications for CEOs, boards, and investors here as well. I think we have, an unbelievably good set of ideas and theories and even best practices around the function. However, I think most people would agree there just isn't quite the systematic pull from boards of directors, CEOs, and investors to bring these, call them talent issues, to the fore and to have a very disciplined way of incorporating talent models, talent evidence, talent considerations into something like the strategic planning process or investor calls or something like that. And so there is a message for CEOs, boards, et cetera, to step back and ask, what are you doing in terms of defining this very malleable role called the CHRO for yourself? And I guess I'd say there's 2 things that come to mind that Pete and I have observed. One of them is that very often CEOs and leadership teams are not really ready for a top-notch CHRO. They simply have not defined the role in a way that any of the top candidates are going to find it particularly interesting or impactful. Or if it's a compliance role, I guess the typical quote we've heard from a few people was, my CEO will say, look, if you want to mess around with stuff like leadership and skills and all that kind of thing, that's fine. But what you get paid for and what your bonus is based on is keeping the HR stuff off my desk. And I just want to know if we're getting people and keeping people. And otherwise, you'd never say that to the CFO. I don't care what you're doing with money, but just keep all that compliance stuff off my desk. It sounds ludicrous, right? So there is a kind of an opportunity to take a framework like this and for CEOs and boards and others to step back and look at these 5 pillars and say, what is this telling us about what we need? And what would we like to see? Are we trapped in a kind of, what shall I say, stereotypical definition of HR? It's that idea of keep all the compliance stuff off my desk and I'm happy. I think a framework like this might cause an interesting discussion to say, well, wait a minute. Some people are saying it isn't just a compliance value proposition. It's also the excellence of the services provided. And it's also teaching the rest of the organization how to make great decisions about people and talent and work. Where are we on that? What if we had an HR function that could do that? Make our leaders the best in our industry when they make decisions about people, for example.
Yeah, it's a diagnostic both for them and as well as for the HR executives themselves to really do that assessment. I equate it like with in finance, right? If you promoted your controller to CFO and then was disappointed that they didn't have FP&A and capital markets, well, you'd be like, you promoted your controller, right? And if you had maybe a HR ops manager and you made them CHRO, like they're going to have gaps too. But if you don't know those differences, which you started this out by saying that often there's just a lack of awareness because of that ambiguity, then we're not necessarily paying attention. So this is going to be great. And it really helps solve some of the language, but we're not waiting for someone to do it for us. It's really about just going in and shaping that role and continuing to shape that role in a way that serves the organization and the business. And my guess is probably pushes everyone to play a better game, right? That's what we do as any functional leader, but certainly as a people leader. John, you use a term called bet the badge moment. And when we first started about talking about courage, we were talking about how in HR sometimes this shows up. And I'd love for you to share a little bit about it.
Thank you, Jamie. That's great. Yeah, one of the things, oh gosh, really through my whole career, but where it really came up was, so just a little bit of background. So, first of all, what do I mean by bet the badge? If you talk to CHROs, you will very often get them telling stories about a moment where their courage was defined by the fact that they had to take a position that was probably going to get them fired, or they thought they were going to get fired. It was in contrast, maybe even in contention with some of the other functions, but it was not the right thing for the people and for the work and the people relationships in the organization. It certainly could be something as blatant as violating a law or something like that, but it's also often more subtle. That it's not that anybody's doing anything particularly illegal or anything like that, but something like this kind of a layoff, or again, not to go down a rabbit hole, but confronting a CEO who says, I want everybody back in the office 5 days a week, bringing to that CEO a more nuanced understanding about the nature of how we need to think about work flexibility and what are the likely costs going to be if you force everybody back and who's likely to leave in frustration with that. Those are hard conversations, and CEOs are often pretty sure they're the smartest person in the room. I wrote a LinkedIn column about this, not to say anything negative about Amazon, but Andy Jassy said, I went and talked to a lot of CEOs and they all are bringing everybody back to work. And so I'm going to bring everybody back to work too. That's not the way I would probably define a scientific way to approach that question, as much as I respect CEOs and their opinion. So that's what I mean by a bet the badge moment. People often talk about, I was pretty sure that I was probably going to get fired for taking this position, but I needed to take it based on a professional ethic or my own understanding of the evidence or what this profession would say is best practice versus bad practice. Very often, of course, the resolution of the story is, and you hear this from a lot of them, the first time you do it, every time you do it, you're nervous. The first time you do it, you're sure you're going to get fired. And then people respect you for it if you've got the right team. And so it does take courage to do it. Now, what's a little bit, what shall I say, provocative, I'll try to be, is I think that we need fewer necessary bet the badge moments. It shouldn't be that bringing something like an evidence based approach to workforce flexibility in the face of a CEO who may be well intentioned but misguided in thinking bringing everybody back is the right thing. I don't know that should be a bet the badge moment, right? It's not a bet the badge moment when the CFO confronts the CEO to say, you're not quite understanding this relationship with money. I know you've heard a lot about this particular financial play. It's not right for us. And let me help you understand why that's the case. I don't know that most people go, oh my God, you're probably going to get fired as a CFO. I think it's expected that the CFO is going to be that kind of an advisor, that they'll be constantly teaching the top team. And the function of finance is constantly teaching everyone how to think better about money. So, my provocative position is I love the courage that's exhibited by the CHROs I've talked to in those bet the badge moments. Part of me says, does it need to be a bet the badge moment to move the needle here on the influence of CEOs, CHROs, and the HR function to a place where the organization is routinely attempting to make better decisions about people and work?
Yeah. And respecting as a subject matter expert or a functional expert, the advice that is data driven and experiential and just their opinion as the leader in that role. I guess that kind of brings us, I really want to just ask then, in summary, your advice for leaders who want to exploit the ambiguity and move up the chain so we have less bet the badge moments and, quite frankly, more impact without having to have that kind of contention or feeling that we might be having to bet our badge.
I guess the first advice, Jamie, is probably to begin to open our minds to the idea. And I'm not saying Pete and I invented it, but I think there is something to this idea that the bottleneck in HR influence, or at least one of them, is less about more data, more models, running the function better so that we get permission to maybe say something about strategy. I think all of that is the traditional way we've developed, and better personal competencies, better interpersonal competencies. Those are all very, very valuable. With due respect, I would say the constraint may be that the position of the function in the sort of ecosystem of leadership at the organization may not be where those things are being heard effectively. And that the first thing might be to step back and ask, in my situation, is it possible that it's that we don't have the platform to deliver this great stuff? And if that's the case, should I begin working on platforms in addition to, but maybe which like less exclusively on just getting better at all the HR stuff and then waiting for someone to say, wow, you're really good. We'd like to invite you to this meeting. Again, a lot of the CHROs said, and these are really good CHROs. I was in the job for 7 years, and it wasn't until then that someone asked me to come to whatever it might be, this meeting, this particular strategy stage, et cetera. And I realized, why did I wait a number of years for someone to invite me? Could I have recognized that as a platform that I could use to be more effective? And once recognized, establish a set of personal tactics, not so much competencies, but specific tactics like, next week, I'm going to propose that we might be able to improve our onboarding process for the board or our succession process, right? One of the things in strategy process is to just go meet the owner. A lot of organizations have a person, usually in finance or the general counsel's office, who runs the strategy process, runs the calendar, runs the cycle. It's interesting how many CHROs don't know that person. And go have lunch with the person who runs your strategy process and talk to them, begin a process of asking, where do talent considerations come in our strategy? And what would happen if we had a discussion earlier in the strategy process about our talent capabilities, our talent gaps, et cetera, in the same way that finance does with money or operations does? Wouldn't that help us better understand our strategic options through a talent lens in the same way that we understand our strategic options through the lens of money or markets or customers, et cetera? So it's two things really. One is to assess across, I would say, all five platforms. This is what Pete and I have been working on, just to step back and do a personal assessment of where am I here? And then ask yourself, which one or two of these, if I moved my impact to the right, would be the most pivotal way for me to enhance the impact of the function and myself, and by extension, then the improvement of our organization in terms of people. That's the assessment stage. And then to step back and say, okay, given the platforms I've identified, where do I already have some credibility, some influence, et cetera? Like we're well regarded already for onboarding. We're well regarded already for providing performance feedback. How could I help my leadership team understand that those capabilities could be really useful somewhere in the leadership team? Again, you get tactics like Ian's. Get on a plane, go visit all the leaders. Other CHROs said you've got to be in the meeting where people are going to look at you and say, what are you doing here? We've never had an HR leader in here before. A lot of those things will bubble up. It's what Pete and I find. It's pretty individual, Jamie. So this is almost more like a coaching endeavor. And because these planning cycles and other cycles are so long, the other thing to recognize is this is not an HR change initiative that you put a date on and say 6 months or a year from now, we will be transformed. This is a more subtle. This is a years long kind of process, and that's what we hear from all the CHROs is you have to understand that this is going to take a few cycles through the strategy process, a few cycles through the cycle of board meetings, and that you can't do this in 6 months. This is something that is subtle, it's incremental, but it can be systematic. And so I think to come up with that systematic plan to say, next week, I'm going to try this little step from where I am today to something that might be on the way toward a path to the what we might call the top of the mountain. And that'll remind me something Pete and I have observed is there's so much good content out there that describes the top of the mountain. You're hearing from a CHRO with 15 years experience. They've been in the role at one of the top Fortune 10 companies forever, and they're telling you what it's like at the top of the mountain. And it is enthralling to hear that. If you're a new CHRO or one of the up next CHROs or me, and what Pete and I are beginning to realize is we think what's often missing is encouraging those folks to step back and talk about how they climbed the mountain and which path did they take and what handholds and footholds were available to them. Those are the data that I think are going to produce a framework that we can use to get people to climb the mountain efficiently and not just feel like I heard that story, but I don't really know what I would do tomorrow to make a difference.
I love that, John. I think all leaders, regardless of function, can be inspired by the agency in which you're talking about approaching your role and the ability for people who have arrived at, say, that top of the mountain to really be sharing the stories of their own paths, not because others will take the exact same paths, but they can find their own shortcuts and learn from the tactics in those past stories that are going to be most applicable to leveraging their strengths and to their businesses today. So I'm so grateful that you joined us. Thank you so much, John.
My pleasure. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And thanks to everyone who's listening. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Courageous Choice. It's truly my honor to be able to talk to people like John, who I've admired for a long time. And we look forward to seeing you on the next episode. Thanks so much. Thank you for listening to The Courageous Choice. If you enjoyed this episode, please leave a 5-star review to help get the word out about the podcast. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of our future conversations. If you'd like to know more about gig talent, please visit gigtalentagency.com or email us at podcast@gigtalentagency.com. See you in the next episode.